I'm really excited to have on the show a gentleman who has pen to the paper in a 3-part series for this week's Farmers Weekly, kicking off in the Pulpit series. And it is a topic that I am very intrigued by, and I know many of our audience also will be. This is about the role that soil carbon can play in our challenges with climate change. But as farmers and growers, how are we able to capture and understand this more, both from an offsetting perspective, but also too from a productivity perspective and a biological perspective to benefit the wider ecosystem. Professor Louis Schipper from the University of Waikato joins us now to discuss this further. Louis, can you please start by painting a little bit of a picture for us about your background in soil carbon, I suppose?
Oh, kia ora. Thanks for having me on. I guess I've been looking at the cycling of carbon and nitrogen in soil for probably 20 or 30 years, and it's really been in the last sort of 10 to 15 years that I've really started thinking more about, well, how much carbon do we have in our soils, and how does it get there? How do we keep it? And are there ways that we might be able to increase the amounts of carbon that are in soil?
I think one of the big debates out there is that we have virgin soils in comparison to the rest of the world, and that our tank is pretty much full when it comes to the ability to store more carbon in our soils. Is that true?
I think by and large that is right. A lot of New Zealand soils, when you show overseas people, scientists from overseas, oh, this is our soil and this is how much carbon we have in it, many of them can't believe how much there is there. And so, yes, we have a lot of carbon in our soils, and that's because we're a relatively young geological country, and we've got soils that are very good at storing and holding onto carbon. And then we've had a long period before humans got here of lots of growth, forests and all that, pumping carbon into the soil so that it builds up and stores there. What we haven't done is we haven't cropped it enormously or used the land too hard so that that carbon could have been lost. So our long-term approach to sort of partial agriculture has generally maintained, or in fact it's even increased the amount of carbon in soil relative to forests. So we haven't lost that carbon that you might see in other parts of the world, like, Central North America, parts of Europe. So yes, we've built a lot of carbon in our soils because of a number of very good reasons.
So what is the untold story here, do you think, Louis, that we really need to be having these conversations around?
Well, I think it's really important that we keep what we have, for me, and that we try and find ways to increase the amount of carbon. We need to take perhaps a step back and ask ourselves, why do we care? There are two main reasons that we're interested in carbon in soil. One is to maintain the quality or the health of our soils. Organic matter or carbon in soil is kind of the centre of all the biological and chemical cycling in soil, and it also gives the soil a lot of physical properties. So it's important to keep the amount of carbon that we have in soils so that we maintain its health. The second thing that we are becoming increasingly interested in is if we can take CO2 out of the atmosphere and store it as carbon in soil, that's a reduction in the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. And so globally, we are interested in trying to find ways of doing that. And that is happening in many countries where they've drawn down their carbon. In New Zealand, like I said, we have quite a lot and it's hard to build up. We're thinking about it, but we don't want to lose it.
And what we can improve is based on what we can measure. And now I understand, I spoke to a lot of soil ecologists in Australia, flat out mapping in Australia and around the world. I understand it is underway here, but your work that you do with the New Zealand Agricultural Greenhouse Gas Research Centre, how far along are we so that we can actually keep a dipstick in what's going on?
A really good question. If we're trying to get at national stocks of carbon to find out how much we have, where we have in New Zealand, we've done some preliminary work that was sort of taking advantage of work that had been done decades ago and resampled some sites so that we could find out how much carbon was there. Now, that was a kind of like do the best you can kind of approach. But now a system has been designed for New Zealand where we are starting to resample or take samples throughout New Zealand in a much more robust, statistically designed approach. And then we will resample those sites over time, and that will allow us at a national scale to understand what our carbon stocks are doing in pastoral soils. We are also looking at and have developed up a method for being able to look at individual farms so that if farmers were interested, they could understand how much carbon they've got and then monitor that through time.
Do you believe that we should be rewarded for holding on to carbon as opposed to the ability to sequester?
I think that it's basically good farming practice to look after your soil carbon. So if you're farming well and caring for your land, and I understand every farmer I've ever spoken to, that's what they are thinking about, looking after the land. And I think a central part of looking after your land is keeping the amount of carbon that you have, so that you have healthy soils and high quality soils. The carbon benefit is also there if you could sequester more. If you lost it, that would be not good for the soil health, and it would not be good for the atmosphere either.
Louis, I don't like to talk politics with scientists, but I actually kind of do, because you get the real deal. When it comes to policy around protecting our soils, how much do you want this to be on the table in terms of how we as a nation absolutely value what is underneath our feet? Because as we have urbanisation sprawl and some of these valuable parts of New Zealand being disrupted and thousands of years worth of beautiful quality topsoil being destroyed, when is enough on that front?
I think looking after our environment more broadly is absolutely critical, and soils sit sort of at the centre of a lot of that. If you think about soils, that's the bit that we're managing, right, to get production. But it's also where the nutrients leave and enter up in waterways, and it's where nitrogen goes into the atmosphere as a greenhouse gas, or CO2 goes into the atmosphere as a gas. So I'm not a policy person, that's quite clear. And policy brings together not just the science that I perhaps have some understanding of, but the way that we as a country want to manage our land. And so you've got to bring in factors of economics, obviously. You've got to bring in factors of culture and social requirements and social justice. So I absolutely see that a good understanding of the way that we manage soils and the way that we look after them is critical for the soil, for the water, and for the air.
What a wonderful way to summarise. I'm not going to let you go because it's International Podcast Day, Louis, and I'm assuming heavily that you are a podcast listener. Could you share with us some of your favourites for our listeners?
Sure. I walk to work and I listen to podcasts on the way there and on the way back, and I have a couple. There's one that's called it's the Serial podcast. So it's SERIAL, which is it's a long format one, and they've done some amazing things. And if you ever want to listen to an incredible podcast about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who has sadly passed, that's one to listen to. But they do a whole series on the Supreme Court, fascinating stuff. So that's a bit sort of detail perhaps, but the other one that I quite like, which is a bit more quirky, is Stuff You Should Know. And it's two guys debating back and forth about all sorts of topics, and they've done soil, so there's something to look for. They've done wetlands, which I also work in, but they do a whole range. They did origami the other day, and so you get all these different kind of quirky. They're a little bit shorter, but great fun.
I was just thinking about that with the algorithms of social media serving us up a plate full of confirmational bias content that it thinks we should know. Things like
Yes.
picking up the Time magazine used to be that way to expand your brain into themes and topics that you wouldn't necessarily seek out. And that's probably why Stuff You Should Know is that sort of wonderful paradise where we can have back the days when we were served up critical thought.
Yes, with a bit of fun in between, right? Because you can get too serious on all this stuff. I mean, it is serious, but you do want lighter moments so that you have time to reflect, right? So I enjoy that balance in those different podcasts.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much, Louis, for appearing on this podcast known as Sarah's Country. And I look forward to following on with your 3-part series. And this is the pulpit section of this week's Farmers Weekly. Check it out today. Soil carbon influences climate, farm productivity, and more to come from Louis. This is Sarah's Country.